Cops arrest a black woman for no reason. Then, Homeland Security agents storm the courtroom. Are you kidding me? I didn't do anything. The words echoed down the cold, fluorescent-lit hallway as Sarah Miller felt the metal bite of handcuffs around her wrists. 1 minute, she was leaving class, thinking about her final exam. The next, she was being shoved into the back of a police car, accused of a crime she didn't even know existed. No questions, no explanation, just 2 cops, a vague, "you match the description," and a sinking feeling that her life was about to be ripped apart. How do you prove your innocence when no one wants to listen? When the system sees you as guilty the moment they lay eyes on you? This isn't just a story, it's a nightmare, and trust me, you won't believe what happens next. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this need to be told. Now, let's get started. Sarah Miller woke to the muted glow of her bedroom lamp, which she always left on low overnight to fight the persistent nightmares that had haunted her for weeks. She had turned 30 last spring, and the milestone had fueled her determination to transform her life. She had enrolled in community college part-time, was volunteering at a local after-school program in her neighborhood of Fairview Heights, and had even begun saving up a little money from her job at the public library. By any outward measure, things were improving. She stood in front of her narrow bedroom mirror, adjusting her blouse and smoothing the front of her charcoal slacks. Her reflection stared back with a curious mix of anticipation and trepidation. Today marked the beginning of final exams at Walton County Community College, and Sarah had put extra effort into her appearance. She wore an auburn headband that accentuated her sleek, dark hair and a matching pair of flats that comforted her tired feet. She had stayed up too late studying for her psychology test, but the moment she stepped outside, she felt the crisp morning air awaken her senses. Fairview Heights was part of a larger city, Riverside, nestled about an hour's drive from New Orleans. The city had a diverse population, lively culture, and a well-known tension between citizens and local law enforcement. Sarah tried not to think about that tension too much as she walked her usual route, passing a small bakery with pastel pink signage and the corner convenience store where Mr. Jones always greeted her with a nod. The rhythmic pattern of Sarah's shoes on the pavement was comforting. It made her feel safe, even if that feeling was only momentary. At precisely 8:15 a.m., she arrived at the bus stop. The bus was usually late, which left Sarah gazing at the horizon, where sunlight broke through towering oak trees. She clutched her worn-out backpack tighter, mentally reviewing the psychology concepts she'd studied. Cognitive dissonance, social conditioning, confirmation bias, all rattling around in her mind like marbles in a tin can. The bus finally lumbered to a stop. Sarah boarded with her usual greeting to the driver, paid her fare, and scanned the seats for a place to settle. She recognized a few fellow students in the back. She nodded hello but chose a seat near the front, wanting to focus on her last-minute reading. As the bus merged into traffic, Sarah's mind drifted to the long to-do list she had ahead. Exam, library shift, volunteer at the after-school center, then grocery shopping. She didn't realize how significant this day would become, how it would shatter her ordinary routine beyond recognition. When she arrived at Walton County Community College, Sarah walked briskly to the classroom for her final exam. Her friend, Lisa Rodman, met her by the door. Lisa was short, fiery, and fiercely intelligent, especially when it came to dissecting social injustices in their classroom discussions. She eyed Sarah's stack of notes with a tired smile. "Ready, Sarah?" Lisa asked, shifting her own backpack from one shoulder to the other. "I pulled an all-nighter. I feel like a zombie." Sarah nodded. "Same here. I just hope my brain doesn't crash midway." The two entered the classroom. Professor Lewis, a tall man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair, was arranging papers on the desk. He offered them both a friendly, if slightly exasperated, grin. After the usual instructions about academic honesty and time limits, Sarah settled into her seat, took out a pencil, and began. The questions came more easily than she'd anticipated. Her intense study sessions seemed to have paid off. She wrote diligently about classical conditioning, the bystander effect, and the intricacies of prejudice within social constructs, a topic she knew all too well from her own experiences. By the time the exam ended, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic. She handed in her paper, exchanged an encouraging nod with Lisa, and left the classroom. Outside, the morning sun had grown hotter, the humidity beginning to gather in the heavy summer air. She stopped by the vending machine to grab a bottle of water, took a long drink, and exhaled in relief. Little did she know that her serenity was about to be shattered. Within hours, Sarah's life would take a turn she never anticipated, and the stage for this unforeseen chaos was set not at the college, but miles away, where a set of eyes in a police cruiser had taken a sudden interest in Sarah Miller's life, an interest that had no valid cause. Sarah had just stepped off the bus in downtown Riverside on her way to the public library for her afternoon shift. The city's tall buildings rose like silent sentinels around her, and midday traffic roared along the thoroughfares. She passed an old church, its large wooden doors open to welcome parishioners seeking refuge from the heat. The clang of a nearby streetcar rattled in her ears as she headed down Elm Street. In front of the library, Sarah paused to admire the refurbished facade. She loved the library's imposing columns and the swirl of mosaic tiles that decorated the entrance. A small plaque read, Walton County Public Library, serving Riverside for 92 years. It gave her a sense of pride to be part of such a legacy. She was nearly at the library's front steps when two uniformed Riverside police officers, Officer Ben Kurt and Officer Kyle Sims, rounded the corner. She hardly noticed them at first, but she caught a flicker of their eyes landing on her. Their presence, normally background noise in a bustling city, suddenly felt intense. Sarah lowered her gaze, trying not to appear nervous, but her heartbeat quickened. She forced a polite smile, nodding a greeting. Both officers locked their gazes on her. One officer, Kurt, raised a hand. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called, stepping into her path. Sarah hesitated, confusion dancing in her eyes. "Yes, officer. May I see some ID?" A tightness coiled in Sarah's stomach. She did not immediately sense the reason behind such a request. She'd grown up with cautionary tales from older family members about interactions with law enforcement. Slowly, she pulled out her wallet. "Sure, but what's this about?" Officer Kurt reached for her ID. His posture was rigid. He looked at her name and photo, then locked eyes with Sarah. "We have some questions for you. Step over here, please." A swirl of anxiety coursed through her. Sarah followed them to the side of the building, away from the main sidewalk foot traffic. People bustled by, indifferent or unaware. Sarah wished someone would notice the tension, maybe intervene, but no one did. Officer Sims's voice came in short bursts, as if he was speaking around an invisible mouthful of nails. "We got a report matching your description." Sarah blinked. "A report of what?" "You've been identified as someone who may have been involved in a disturbance at a liquor store across town," said Kurt, his gaze unrelenting. Sarah froze, feeling disbelief well up. "That's not possible. I've never been in that store. I don't even drink." Officer Sims stiffened. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us and answer a few more questions downtown." A wave of terror hit Sarah. She had no idea what was going on. "There's some mistake," she insisted. "I just came from class at Walton County Community College. You can call my professor, talk to my classmates. I have an alibi. I was on campus all morning." Kurt's lips formed a thin line. "We can clear it up at the station." He grabbed Sarah's arm. The world seemed to spin in that moment. She felt the cold metal of handcuffs on her wrists. Embarrassment mixed with panic as passers-by turned heads. Some looked concerned, others simply rubbernecked, and a few even snickered or whispered amongst themselves. Nobody stepped in to help. Sarah, tears threatening to spill, felt her voice quake. "This is wrong. I haven't done anything." She was promptly read her Miranda rights, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the words. She was guided, more like pushed, into the back of a police cruiser. The seat felt suffocating. The stale smell of vinyl and old sweat made her stomach churn. She stared out the window, eyes wide, as downtown Riverside receded into the distance. She recognized the route vaguely. They were heading to the Riverside Police Department, an imposing concrete building that loomed over a nearby highway. During the drive, Sarah struggled to comprehend what was happening. She tried to speak rationally, to insist they had made a mistake, that she was Sarah Miller, a part-time student, a library employee, and a volunteer, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Kurt and Sims exchanged glances occasionally, muttering into their radios, but gave her no answers. By the time they arrived at the station, Sarah felt numb. She was escorted through a back entrance, where the public didn't see detainees. They brought her to a stark processing area, white walls, fluorescent lights, everything reeking of bleach. Her belongings were taken: purse, phone, wallet and placed into a plastic bin. She was fingerprinted, photographed, then led to a cramped holding cell. The heavy metal door clanged shut behind her, echoing through the lonely space. Inside were two other women, each slumped in separate corners. One gave Sarah a sharp glance, but said nothing. Another stared at the ceiling, as though existing in her own world. Sarah, uncertain and terrified, sank down on the bench. She steadied her trembling hands in her lap and tried to focus on the raw fact of her innocence. They had no evidence. She was nowhere near that liquor store. This had to be a nightmare, a horrific misunderstanding that would be cleared up in a matter of hours. At least, that's what she told herself. But minute after agonizing minute, hour after hour passed, and no officer came to speak with her. No one listened to her calls for help. She felt invisible, locked away from her life while the rest of the world continued on outside. Her job shift started and ended without her. Her volunteer hours slipped away. Darkness fell, and the overhead light in the cell continued to glare down relentlessly, allowing no rest or respite. That night, Sarah sat awake, knees drawn to her chest, replaying every minute of the day. The cops had arrested her for no reason she could discern. Her innocence was so obvious to her, but she realized with dawning dread that it wasn't obvious to them. And if no one bothered to look more closely, how would the truth ever come to light? She closed her eyes, fighting tears. Exhaustion and fear battled within her. Above all, Sarah prayed that someone, Lisa, her professors, her co-workers, would come searching for her. She needed an ally. For the first time in her life, she truly understood the terrifying vulnerability of being powerless behind bars. By the time Sarah was escorted out of the holding cell the next morning, she had barely slept. At 6 a.m., a corrections officer barked for the detainees to rise. Sarah's head swam with fatigue. She wanted a shower, to brush her teeth, to do anything normal, to remind herself she was still a person. Instead, she was given a dry pastry and tepid water. Around 10 a.m., she was led down a series of corridors to an interrogation room. The cramped, fluorescent-lit space had a single metal table with two chairs. A large mirror covered one wall, and Sarah knew from TV shows and rumors that this was a one-way window, behind which others could be watching. She tried to steady herself. Moments later, a detective entered. His nameplate read N. Lancer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that bore the stress lines of decades on the job. He dropped a file folder on the table. "Miss Miller," he said in a gravelly voice, "we'd like to ask you some questions." Sarah swallowed, her throat parched. "I'll answer anything. I'm innocent." Detective Lancer eyed her carefully. "Yesterday, a man named Bryce Olson was assaulted at a liquor store on Maple Avenue." The clerk gave a statement describing a female suspect who fled the scene. She claimed the assailant was a black woman in her 20s, wearing a white shirt and dark pants. Sarah gaped. That could be half the city. Lancer glanced at his file. "The clerk also identified you in a photo lineup. That's why you were brought in." A spike of fear shot through her. "How? That's impossible. I wasn't there. I was at Walton County Community College, taking an exam. If you just check with my professor." He raised a hand. "We'll confirm your alibi, but you need to be patient." "Patient?" Sarah's frustration and desperation boiled over. "You arrested me in front of the library where I work. You never asked for my side of the story. It's humiliating, and it's flat out wrong." She watched his expression soften slightly, but there was a stubborn set to his jaw. "Look, Miss Miller, I'm just doing my job. If it's a mistake, we'll find that out. But for now, you're a suspect." "Then investigate," Sarah pleaded. "Find the store's CCTV. Ask my college. I'm sure I'm on their cameras, too." Lancer let out a heavy breath. "We're in the process." He offered her a paper cup of water, which she gratefully accepted, gulping it down to soothe her dry throat. "If your story checks out, you'll be released." But the clerk was quite certain. Sarah felt tears of frustration, but she forced them down. She had to keep herself composed. "I am innocent," she repeated, voice trembling but determined. "I'll be back," Lancer said, standing. "Stay put." He left, and Sarah was alone in the interrogation room for what felt like an eternity. She stared at the peeling paint on the walls, the swirling patterns on the cheap linoleum floor. Every second without information was another spike of anxiety. Would they really take steps to confirm her alibi, or would they bury her under bureaucratic suspicion? Eventually, a female officer escorted Sarah back to her cell. There was no further questioning that day, nor the next. Time stretched into an unrecognizable haze. each hour interspersed with Sarah's attempts to glean any piece of information from the guards. All she received were grunts and dismissals. One guard even sneered at her, muttering under his breath about another troublemaker. Sarah wanted to scream. Days passed before she finally found out she was being formally charged with second-degree assault. It came from a public defender, a thin, overworked man who introduced himself as Jason Boyd, in the dingy hallway outside Sarah's holding cell. He had a stack of case files tucked under his arm and wore a wrinkled suit that hung awkwardly on his lanky frame. "What do you mean I'm charged?" Sarah demanded, keeping her voice low to hide the quake of fear. "I was nowhere near the store." Boyd flipped open a manila folder. "I see your statement. You claim you have an alibi at the community college. The prosecution is saying the security footage is inconclusive and the victim's statement IDs you as the attacker. The store clerk claims they saw you too." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "But there's no way the footage is inconclusive. I wasn't there." Boyd shrugged, offering a helpless look. "I'll be honest with you, this is a tough county. The district attorney's office has a reputation for pushing cases based on eyewitness testimony. There's a big election coming up, and they're under pressure to show they're tough on crime." Sarah's thoughts spiraled. "You have to prove my innocence. Please. We'll request your college's attendance logs, plus statements from your professor and classmates. If everything lines up, we can argue you had no opportunity to commit the crime." Sarah wanted to cling to that hope, but the process seemed slow, labyrinthine, and burdened by stereotypes. "When's my hearing?" "Your arraignment is next Tuesday. Then we'll see if bail is set. But the prosecutor might argue you're a flight risk." "Flight risk?" Sarah let out a humorless laugh. "I'm a student. I have a job, a volunteer position. My entire life is here. Where would I run?" Boyd placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I believe you, but the system can be cruel. Let's focus on building your defense." By the time he left, Sarah was torn between gratitude for his help and dread at how incompetent or overwhelmed he seemed. Another wave of hopelessness washed over her. Being innocent and proving innocence were two different things entirely. She returned to the stale confines of her cell, locked behind bars with all her fears. But Sarah refused to give up. She began to systematically list every piece of evidence that could exonerate her: time-stamped bus passes, camera footage from the library, her exam schedule. She resolved to gather the truth, determined to fight. Unknown to her, events were already in motion, far beyond the walls of Riverside Police Department. Events that would transform her simple fight for justice into a cataclysmic showdown in the local courthouse. And Sarah's greatest allies would come from corners she never expected, while her worst enemies would wear badges and suits in high places. A week later, Sarah stood in a chilly courtroom for her arraignment, shackled at the ankles and wrists. The courthouse was a stern granite building with echoing hallways and solemn-faced officials. Sarah's heart pounded as she surveyed the room. She could see her parents in the gallery, wide-eyed and distraught. A few of Sarah's friends from college had also shown up, Lisa included, each giving Sarah encouraging nods. On one side, the prosecutor, a wiry woman in her 50s named Carol Larson, sat with an air of confidence. Sarah recognized her from local news reports. Larson was known for pushing for maximum penalties and rarely accepting plea deals. Next to Sarah stood Jason Boyd, leafing through some documents. The judge, Paul Tyson, a towering presence with a stern face, entered. Everyone rose. The bailiff announced the start of the session. Case number 2394, the people of Riverside versus Sarah Miller, the bailiff intoned. Sarah drew a shaky breath as the hearing began. Larson read out the charges: second-degree assault, battery, and disturbing the peace. Sarah's heart clenched with every count. She wanted to scream, "I didn't do it. This is a sham." But she kept her silence, letting Boyd speak on her behalf. He argued for Sarah's release on her own recognizance, pointing out her strong community ties, the absence of any previous criminal record, and her established alibi. But Larson countered with the alleged victim's testimony, the store clerk's identification, and Sarah's lack of cooperation with officers at the time of arrest. A blatant lie, Sarah thought. She had cooperated fully, but the police had barely listened. Judge Tyson peered down. His expression was not entirely unsympathetic, but he erred on the side of caution. He set a bail amount Sarah knew she couldn't afford, $50,000. When he banged the gavel, Sarah slumped. She saw her father whisper something urgently to her mother. Lisa clasped her hands to her mouth in shock. Sarah was led away, tears threatening to spill. Back in the lockup area after the hearing, Sarah was startled to see a face she recognized. It was Julia Kane, a local reporter who sometimes covered city council meetings on the public access channel. She was pressing through a gaggle of onlookers, trying to get a quote. "Miss Miller, Sarah, do you have a statement about the charges?" Sarah paused, her voice shaky. "I'm innocent," she managed. "This is a terrible mistake. That's all I can say right now." Julia jotted down notes, her expression earnest. "We'll keep an eye on your case." Sarah appreciated even that small glimmer of attention from the media. Maybe the public scrutiny would force the police to work faster or realize the truth. The next day brought some relief. Sarah's family managed to secure a loan against their modest home, combined with a donation drive organized by Lisa and a small but impassioned group of Sarah's classmates. They scraped together enough for bail. When Sarah finally walked out of the county jail, the late afternoon sun felt like a benediction on her skin. Her mother, Clara Miller, a warm-hearted nurse, rushed forward to wrap Sarah in a fierce hug. Her father, Mark, stood beside them, tears brimming in his usually stern eyes. "Baby, I'm so sorry," her mother whispered. "We're going to get you through this." Lisa, who had been organizing the fundraiser, joined them. "We have to fight this, Sarah. We're not going to let them do this to you." Sarah inhaled deeply, trying not to cry. She had always been the one to handle her own problems, but in this moment, she realized she needed her community, her friends, her family. After the emotional reunion, Sarah went home. Her childhood bedroom, with its lavender walls and framed posters of old jazz musicians, felt like a sanctuary. She spent the evening poring over every detail of the case with her parents and Lisa. They called the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, local chapter for advice. They researched organizations that help people wrongfully accused. Even though Sarah had a public defender, she wanted every angle covered. Then came an unexpected turn. Julia Kane, the reporter, contacted her over the phone. Julia said, "Miss Miller, I've been looking into the liquor store case. The city's CCTV cameras near Maple Avenue might show who was actually there that day. I spoke to a source at City Hall who told me the footage was flagged for a separate investigation. They wouldn't elaborate, but it sounds like there may be something bigger going on." Sarah's heartbeat quickened. Why wouldn't they release that footage? There's some hush-hush talk about an ongoing investigation at that liquor store. "I'm still piecing it together," Julia explained. It made no sense to Sarah, but she grabbed onto the lead. "If you learn more, let me know. This is my life on the line." "I will," Julia promised. "You stay strong." When she hung up, Sarah felt a surge of hope. Perhaps Julia's instincts would uncover evidence that exonerated her. She just had to endure the storm. Little did she know that storm was about to get more violent than she could ever imagine. The forces at work went far beyond a simple assault case. Sarah was about to be a pawn in a complex game that involved local law enforcement, shadowy deals, and, unbeknownst to her, agents from the Department of Homeland Security, who had their own agendas tied into the city's war on terror programs. And it would all come to a terrifying head in the courtroom, where Sarah's life and liberty hung in the balance. The next couple of weeks were a whirlwind of attempts to gather evidence and prepare for Sarah's preliminary hearing. Jason Boyd did his best to collect witness statements from Sarah's classmates and professors. He requested security footage from both the college and the city. Frustratingly, the city cited bureaucratic delays, claiming the street camera near Maple Avenue was undergoing maintenance at the time of the incident, meaning no footage was available. Sarah smelled a cover-up, or at the very least, gross incompetence. She refocused on proving her presence on campus at the time of the assault. The college, however, was also slow in producing official attendance logs and security camera footage due to privacy concerns. Sarah felt trapped by endless red tape. Each request took days to process. Every delay gave the prosecution more time to bolster their questionable case against her. Meanwhile, Julia Kane kept digging. She met Sarah at a coffee shop near the courthouse one chilly afternoon. Julia had tired eyes and a notepad filled with scribbles. She got right to the point. "I spoke to an insider at the Riverside Police Department. They claimed there was a Homeland Security presence in the area the day of that liquor store assault. Something about a potential domestic terror suspect being tracked." Sarah blinked in confusion. What? Apparently, DHS had eyes on a group rumored to be plotting something in Riverside. Details are scarce, but my source said that local law enforcement was cooperating with Homeland Security agents, and they're particularly secretive about Maple Avenue because of this operation. Sarah felt both relief and foreboding. So maybe the Real suspect is part of that group, and the police zeroed in on me for the assault too. What? Make the case look closed? Julia shrugged. Could be. Or they genuinely have no clue, and they're just blindly following procedure. Either way, DHS involvement means less transparency. They don't want to blow their operation. Suddenly, Sarah understood how her life had become collateral damage in some bigger federal operation. The pieces began to click. It wasn't just a simple case of mistaken identity. She was caught in a swirl of secrecy and possibly incompetent policing. Despite the new information, Sarah still felt vulnerable. That feeling only intensified when, one evening, her father showed her a letter they received in the mail. It was typed, no return address. It read, "It's in your best interest not to stir up trouble. Let the courts do their job. Don't talk to the press." Fury pulsed through Sarah. The intimidation was blatant, and it only strengthened her resolve to fight. She asked Julia if she'd received any threats, and the reporter confirmed she got an anonymous tip telling her to stop meddling. The fear of an unknown enemy loomed, but Sarah pressed on. At the preliminary hearing, Carol Larson argued passionately that Sarah should face trial. Larson painted Sarah as a volatile individual who had resisted arrest. She also claimed Sarah's so-called alibi was unverified. The judge, again, seemed uneasy but let the charges stand, scheduling a formal trial date a month later. Sarah's friends, family, and coworkers were dismayed, but Sarah's gaze remained firm. She would stand her ground. On the evening after the hearing, Sarah returned to her parents' home and received unexpected news, a phone call from an unknown number. When she picked up, a man's voice, low and tense, said, "Miss Miller, I know you're innocent. I have information that could help you, but you have to meet me discreetly. Tomorrow night, outside the old Riverside Mall. Midnight." "Who is this?" Sarah demanded, but the line went dead. She debated ignoring the call, but desperation for the truth compelled her. Lisa insisted on coming along, unwilling to let her friend venture into a potentially dangerous situation alone. Late the next night, they drove out to the old, abandoned mall at the edge of Riverside. Its parking lot was cracked, overgrown with weeds, and illuminated by a single flickering streetlight. They waited. At 12:10 a.m., a figure emerged, a slender man in a hoodie. His face was partially shadowed, but Sarah could see sharp, anxious eyes. He introduced himself as Frank, offering no last name. He claimed to be a low-level clerk at the Riverside Police Department. "I shouldn't even be talking to you," Frank whispered. "I found documents in a shared folder at the station. They suggest the liquor store incident was overshadowed by a DHS stakeout. The real suspect was a man the feds have been after, and they orchestrated some weird cover-up or sting. Local cops got so fixated on their bigger target that they pinned the assault on the first person they found who matched a vague description." Sarah's heart pounded. Why would they keep it going now that they know I'm not involved? Frank gave a helpless shrug. They can't admit they messed up. The clerk's ID gave them a scapegoat, maybe pressured or coached in. The actual suspect likely fled, so you became their convenient solution to close the assault case. Also, since DHS is involved, they don't want details leaking about their operation. That's all I know. I'm risking my job, and maybe more, just telling you this. Lisa gently placed a hand on Sarah's arm, grounding her. Sarah stared at Frank, absorbing the shock. "We need proof," she said. "Documents, files, anything. Can you help?" He shifted nervously. "I might be able to get a copy of the internal memo, but you have to promise you won't say where you got it." Sarah nodded, barely able to speak. "I understand." He handed her a slip of paper. "There's a time and place. I'll drop it at the fountain in Riverside Park at dawn on Sunday. Good luck." Then he hurried off, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting to be followed. Sarah and Lisa stood in stunned silence under the flickering light. Everything they'd suspected was now confirmed. Sarah was a pawn in a high-stakes operation that local cops and DHS wanted to keep under wraps. If they succeeded, Sarah would go to prison for a crime she never committed. The vow Sarah made that night was simple. She would not be a casualty of their scheme. She would fight back, expose the cover-up, and clear her name. And in doing so, she might bring down more than a few powerful people along the way. Little did she know, Her vow would collide with the unstoppable force of federal agents in a dramatic scene that would play out in the very courtroom meant to administer justice. Sunday arrived, and Sarah was up before dawn. She and Lisa drove to Riverside Park, parking a block away. They made their way to the large, broken fountain in the center of the park. Sunlight filtered through the tall oaks, their leaves rustling in the morning breeze. Nobody else seemed around except a lone jogger. A folded envelope sat on the lip of the fountain. Sarah's heart raced as she picked it up. She checked inside, several photocopied pages. The text was small, official, stamped with the Riverside Police Department seal, and with references to HSI Homeland Security investigations. It described an ongoing operation aimed at intercepting potential domestic terror suspects near Maple Avenue. The documents mentioned a primary suspect who matched a completely different physical description than Sarah. The store clerk's statement was flagged as contradictory. Sarah exhaled a shaky breath. This was the proof. She carefully tucked it in her purse. The next few days were a rush of planning. Sarah showed the documents to Julia Kane, who verified they seemed legitimate, though partially redacted. Julia wrote up a preliminary article to break the story, but she also cautioned Sarah, the second this goes public, DHS might double down. We have to be careful how we release this information. Jason Boyd was stunned when Sarah handed him the packet. If this is real, it could blow the prosecution's case out of the water. He immediately filed motions to request the full, unredacted documents through discovery. Carol Larson, the prosecutor, responded with stony silence and refused to acknowledge the document's authenticity. The trial date loomed. On the morning of proceedings, Sarah arrived at the courthouse wearing a modest black suit. The corridor outside the courtroom buzzed with tension. Press cameras flashed, capturing Sarah's set jaw and determined eyes. Her parents held her hands. Lisa stood behind them, unwavering. Julia was present, too, scribbling furiously in her notepad. Inside, the judge, the jury, and the attorneys took their places. As Sarah waited for the start, she glanced nervously around. She saw the police officers who had arrested her, Kurt and Sims, sitting behind Larson, whispering with the DA. Detective Lancer entered, avoiding Sarah's gaze. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Larson began her opening statement, repeating the same allegations. Sarah had assaulted Bryce Olson during an altercation, and the liquor store clerk identified her. Boyd retorted in his opening, describing Sarah's rock-solid alibi and the bizarre inconsistencies in the state's case. He alluded to documents that cast serious doubt on the prosecution's narrative. Larson looked visibly tense. Then, as the judge was about to call the first witness, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. The doors swung open, and a group of dark-suited men and women strode in, Homeland Security agents. Their presence was electric, hushes and gasps falling over the spectators. One of them, a tall agent with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped forward and handed a file to Carol Larson, speaking in hushed tones. The judge banged his gavel to restore order. Larson, for once, looked genuinely rattled. She conferred with the agent, scanning documents he gave her. Sarah's anxiety spiked. Why were they here now? Judge Tyson eyed the group. What is the meaning of this? Identify yourselves and explain your intrusion. The tall agent spoke, voice firm. Your Honor, we are with the Department of Homeland Security. We have an urgent matter involving national security that intersects with the defendant's case. We must address the court immediately. A stunned silence followed. Larson appeared furious, forced into a corner. The judge's frown deepened, but he allowed the agent to speak. The agent cleared his throat, scanning the gallery with a sober expression. We have reason to believe that the real assailant in the Maple Avenue liquor store incident was a suspect in a federal investigation. Miss Sarah Miller is, in our view, not that suspect, and the identification provided by local witnesses may have been coerced or mistaken. Sarah felt a surge of relief, mingled with disbelief. It was happening. Her innocence was finally being acknowledged. But the path was more dramatic than she ever imagined. She risked a glance at her parents. They looked stunned, hopeful, tears in their eyes. Larson tried to interject. Your Honor, we need to verify. The agent cut her off. We have verified. My team and I have just concluded part of our operation. The real suspect was apprehended out of state. He has no resemblance to Miss Miller. Judge Tyson leaned forward, brow furrowed. What about the charges against Miss Miller? Are you saying she's innocent? A few DHS agents exchanged glances. The tall one nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We're prepared to testify that local law enforcement erred in arresting Miss Miller based on faulty eyewitness testimony. Further, we believe certain documents about our operations were withheld from the defense, which is a violation of Brady material disclosure. Sarah's breath caught. Brady material. The requirement that the prosecution must disclose evidence favorable to the defense. That meant Riverside PD, or possibly the DA's office, had kept crucial, exculpatory evidence hidden. Carol Larson's face was a mask of fury and humiliation. She glared at the tall agent. Your Honor, I object to this ambush. We had no prior knowledge. The judge shot her a stern look. Silence, counselor. I will not allow a miscarriage of justice if the Department of Homeland Security has evidence that exonerates the defendant. At that moment, Sarah felt a rush of dizzying emotion. Relief, vindication, anger at the system that nearly destroyed her, and an overwhelming gratitude that the truth was finally surfacing. The judge cleared his throat, signaled for Sarah to stand. Miss Miller, approach. Heart hammering, Sarah stepped forward, with Boyd at her side. The judge addressed the court. In light of this new information, it appears Miss Miller may have been wrongly accused. I am dismissing this case with prejudice. The words seemed to echo. Case dismissed. Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, but these tears were of profound release. Her life was no longer on trial, but the drama wasn't over. In the next breath, Judge Tyson leveled a gaze at the prosecutors and the police officers involved. We will be looking into why this exculpatory information was not shared sooner. Furthermore, the court will consider whether sanctions against the Riverside Police Department or the District Attorney's Office are appropriate. Court is adjourned. He banged the gavel, and Sarah's world burst into a whirlwind of chaotic relief. Her family leaped to their feet, rushing to embrace her. Lisa was crying, half laughing. Julia Kane snapped photos, capturing Sarah's exoneration. The officers who arrested Sarah slunk out, avoiding the gaze of reporters. But Sarah noticed the shadowed stares of some of the DHS agents as they exited. She couldn't tell if they saw her as a victim of the system or just an inconvenient byproduct of their covert operations. Either way, Sarah's name was cleared. Yet, in the midst of the crowd's cheers and Sarah's newfound freedom, she had no idea a fresh wave of retribution was coming. Karma would not remain silent. There would be reckoning, and it would catch certain individuals off guard. Some who perpetuated Sarah's nightmare were about to face a storm of their own. Walking out of the courthouse that day felt surreal to Sarah. The midday sun warmed her face, and she inhaled the sweet scent of freedom. Cameras clicked in her direction. Local media wanted interviews. Lisa squeezed Sarah's hand and whispered, "You did it. You survived." But Sarah wasn't just relieved. She was angry. She'd been forced to endure the horror of a false arrest, jail time, and a looming trial. For weeks, she had lost shifts at work, nearly lost her place in the community college, and carried the weight of trauma from being caged for something she hadn't done. "I'm suing," she declared to her family as they drove away from the courthouse. Riverside PD, the DA's office. "I want accountability." A few days later, Sarah met with a civil rights attorney recommended by the local ACLU chapter. The attorney, Lydia Parks, was formidable. She had a commanding presence, with braids woven tightly back and eyes that revealed no tolerance for injustice. After reviewing Sarah's case, Lydia nodded sharply. "We have grounds for a civil rights lawsuit, unlawful arrest, malicious prosecution, and withholding of exculpatory evidence. We'll file against the city and the officers involved." That same week, Julia Kane released an explosive article detailing Sarah's ordeal and the DHS cover-up. The local news outlets picked up the story. Soon, Sarah's name was splashed across headlines. Innocent student wrongly accused. Cover-up by local police exposed. Public outcry followed. Protesters marched near the Riverside Police Department, holding signs that read, "Justice for Sarah," and "No more racial profiling." Within the department, a series of internal investigations began. Officers Ben Kurt and Kyle Sims found themselves under intense scrutiny for failing to corroborate Sarah's alibi. Detective Lancer faced questions about ignoring contradictory evidence. Even District Attorney Carol Larson received backlash. Local politicians demanded her resignation. The city council launched an inquiry into prosecutorial misconduct. Then came a shocking press conference. The mayor, Robert Stone, a usually conservative figure, stood on the steps of City Hall, and addressed the public, cameras rolling. "The events surrounding Miss Sarah Miller are unacceptable," he began, voice somber. "Justice demands we thoroughly investigate why her innocence was overlooked. Our city cannot tolerate the violation of an individual's rights under any circumstances." The next day, Sarah's attorney filed her lawsuit. The city was put on notice. The tide of karma began to roar. Kurt and Sims were placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of an internal affairs investigation. Detective Lancer was demoted and forced to hand over all notes to an independent panel. Carol Larson's reputation suffered a mortal blow. She stepped down after the city council implied they would move to impeach her if she didn't resign. Karma, it seemed, was swift and unsparing. For Sarah, the emotional toll was still heavy. Each night, she wrestled with dreams of that cramped jail cell, the humiliation of handcuffs, and the fear that her life was no longer hers. She sought therapy, determined to reclaim her mental health. With family and friends by her side, she gradually found moments of peace and even triumph amid the chaos. With the end of the criminal case, Sarah returned to Walton County Community College. Her professors welcomed her back warmly, offering her a chance to complete missed assignments. Students and faculty cheered her on, their support unwavering. At the public library, Sarah was met with flowers, hugs from coworkers, and heartfelt congratulations from patrons who had followed her story. One bright afternoon, she received a letter on official stationery. Opening it, her eyes widened. It was from Dr. Mason, the director of the after-school program where she volunteered. He wrote, "Sarah, your strength and dedication to our community has been an inspiration. We'd be honored if you'd accept a full-time position as outreach coordinator. We'll schedule around your classes, and you'll receive full benefits. We need more people like you to guide our youth." Sarah felt tears of joy. Even though she was still coping with the legal and emotional aftermath, life offered her a chance to rebuild. She promptly accepted. Weeks turned into months. The civil lawsuit progressed, with depositions and legal maneuvers. Sarah gave hours of testimony about her ordeal. The city, in an attempt to limit damage, moved toward a settlement. After negotiations, Sarah was awarded a substantial sum, enough to cover her legal bills, further her education, and start a fund for criminal justice reform efforts in Riverside. She used part of the money to help her parents pay off their mortgage and repay friends who had contributed to her bail. And Sarah wasn't done fighting. She launched a new community initiative called True Justice, dedicated to helping innocent people navigate the legal system and to demanding transparency in law enforcement. The local ACLU chapter partnered with her, hosting workshops on knowing one's rights and filing formal complaints against misconduct. Sarah stood at the forefront, her voice calm, firm, and courageous, a living testament to the power of resistance. Meanwhile, the officers who wronged her faced their own reckoning. Kurt and Sims were eventually fired. Internal Affairs found them guilty of violating department policies by arresting Sarah without proper probable cause and failing to investigate her claims of innocence. Detective Lancer, by then a disgraced figure in the department, retired early under a cloud of suspicion. The FBI opened a separate inquiry into whether Riverside PD had a pattern of racial profiling and misconduct. Carol Larson never held public office again, her tarnished record ensuring that no political door would willingly open for her. A few months later, Sarah's personal life found an unexpected highlight. She and Lisa attended a city council meeting to advocate for body cameras on all officers. They delivered impassioned speeches. Afterward, Sarah was approached by a tall, friendly man in a crisp suit, Tom Jordan, a new city council member who had run on a platform of reform. He thanked her for her activism, noting how her case had propelled him into action. Over time, Sarah and Tom connected on a personal level, eventually sparking a quiet romance. In Sarah's darkest nights, she never imagined that new love could be part of her journey toward healing. On the one-year anniversary of her arrest, Sarah stood in Riverside Park, near the same fountain where she had picked up those crucial documents, and addressed a small crowd gathered for a True Justice rally. Julia Kane was there, scribbling notes for another article. Sarah's parents sat front row, beaming with pride. Lisa, her steadfast friend, filmed the speech on her phone. Sarah's voice carried across the open space, filled with conviction. "A year ago, I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. I was silenced, terrified, and nearly consumed by despair. But thanks to the unwavering support of this community and a determination not to let falsehood stand, I'm here today, free and fighting back. My story isn't unique. There are thousands of people wrongly targeted, swept into the criminal justice system, and left to rot. We can't allow it. Each of us must hold our institutions accountable. We must fight for the innocent, demand transparency, and ensure that every voice, especially those long ignored, is finally heard. Applause rippled through the crowd. Sarah glanced around, feeling tears of pride. This was the city she now fought for, a city with profound problems, but also people striving for change. In that moment, Sarah recognized how far she'd come, from a terrified young woman in a holding cell to an activist, a beacon of hope. She could still feel the scars of her ordeal, but she wore them like armor, ready for whatever battles lay ahead. And as she stepped off the makeshift stage to embrace her parents, Sarah felt a quiet sense of peace and promise. Hard as it had been, justice had prevailed, and perhaps, slowly but surely, a new era for Riverside was dawning. Months flowed into years, and Sarah Miller's name became synonymous with resilience and reform in Riverside. The True Justice Initiative expanded, partnering with regional nonprofit groups to train volunteers as court observers, ensuring transparent proceedings for defendants who might not otherwise have a voice. Sarah finished her associate's degree, then enrolled in a full criminal justice program at a nearby university, determined to become a lawyer herself in time. Riverside adopted sweeping changes: mandatory body cameras, external oversight committees for police-involved incidents, and improved accountability measures for prosecutors. While not every problem vanished overnight, the shift in local culture was unmistakable. From time to time, Sarah still revisited the corners of her memories where fear lingered, a fleeting flash of handcuffs, the sour taste of stale air in a holding cell. But each memory reminded her of the collective power people wield when they refused to accept injustice. She continued her volunteer work, now as part of her new, full-time position at the after-school program. The kids adored her. Many came from tough neighborhoods, where trust in law enforcement was minimal. Sarah's influence provided them a glimpse of a path forward, a belief that they deserved fairness, and that the system should serve them, not devour them. In a proud moment, Sarah was invited to speak at the American Civil Liberties Union's national conference. She recounted her story to activists from across the country. Her voice wavered only slightly as she described the humiliations of her arrest and the monstrous unfairness of the charges. But when she spoke of the community that rallied to her side and the changes achieved in Riverside, her tone soared with hope and possibility. She closed with a single, powerful statement: "Our truth is our power, and when we unite around that truth, no injustice can stand forever." After the conference, Sarah found Julia Kane waiting for her backstage, eager to catch up. The reporter smiled. "You've come a long way, Sarah." Sarah smiled back softly. "You were one of the first to believe in me. Thank you for that." "It was the truth," Julia said, shrugging as if it were obvious. "I'm just glad it all came out." They parted ways, both feeling the hum of optimism that comes when truth triumphs over lies. That evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room, reflecting on her journey. It was a testament to the fact that karma isn't just about revenge or cosmic payback. It's about the seeds we sow and the harvest that follows. The cops who arrested her without cause and the prosecution that almost destroyed her life had faced their own downfall through public and legal accountability. But more importantly, Sarah's fight had sown seeds of progress, empathy, and reform. The ripple effects of her story would continue, inspiring people far beyond Riverside. Exhausted but hopeful, she opened her laptop to work on her law school applications, a gentle smile on her face. The old Sarah Miller, a shy library clerk, uncertain of her place in the world, was gone. In her place stood a determined woman, ready to champion the marginalized and speak against abuses of power. Her final thought before drifting to sleep was a simple prayer: "May no one else suffer what I suffered. And if they do, may they find a community that stands by them, just like I did." She closed her eyes. The lights of the city glowed through the window, symbolizing a future where justice, though slow at times, prevails in the end. And just like that, justice was finally served. Sarah walked out of that courtroom a free woman, but the scars of what she endured would never fully fade. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, falsely accused, or crushed by a system that refused to see the truth. But here's the thing about injustice. It only wins if we let it. Sarah didn't stay quiet. She stood up. She fought back. And in the end, she made damn sure that the people who tried to ruin her life faced their own reckoning. Her story isn't just about survival. It's about change. And if you believe in holding power accountable, if you believe in standing up for what's right, then make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this, they deserve to be heard. Hit that subscribe button now, and I'll see you in the next one.